I think we'd probably better start then. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Sorry we're a tiny bit late. We're just waiting for one speaker who will be with us shortly but is having technical issues, so she'll join us as we go through. So just to let you know, this is being recorded and will be made available online after the event. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so if you want to pose a question, if you use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, we will visit those questions once the speakers have finished talking. So yeah, I will welcome you all to the first of the Place webinar series this autumn and hand you over to Ella, who will kick things off with the introductions. Thanks, Ella.
Hi. So firstly, thank you very much for joining us today, wherever you are. And I'd like to introduce myself and my colleagues. I'm Ella Furness and I work on a project called Tea Grains, which is led by Angelina Sanderson-Bellamy at the Sustainable Places Research Institute. My research interests are community-led resource management, forests and ecological restoration. And Angelina, who heads the project, uses socio-ecological frameworks to research sustainable food systems, land use changes, ecological resilience and ecosystem services. Here with us today as well, we've got Dr. Hannah Pitt, who's a research fellow who is researching skills and knowledge within food systems with a focus on horticulture and community-led action for sustainability. We've got Dr. Poppy Nicol, who's a research associate working on biocultural diversity, agroecology and seed saving practices, and Alice Tahaserde, who is a PhD candidate researching social movement learning and popular education with a focus on agroecology and sustainability transitions. So our commonality is that we were all working on different aspects of the food system when the corona crisis began. And as I'm sure as most people noticed, the food system in the UK underwent some shocks. For example, 86% of participants in our research stocked up on food when the crisis began back in March and April, which gives us an idea of the scale of behaviour change that the crisis has triggered. So at the beginning of the crisis, what we did is we modified existing research projects to collect data on how producers, consumers and community organisers adapted to the changes. And to understand impacts on producers, we worked with Food Sense Wales, Peas Please and Tubby Cymru to gather data from fruit and veg growers. There was an online survey which was completed by 34 growers. And these surveys were then supplemented with a conference call with more growers and NGOs, as well as interviews with 2 Welsh seed producers. The insights from community organisers were gathered through 4 interviews with prior contacts known to be active in local crisis response, as well as participant observation in network meetings with 40 organisers from community food initiatives across Wales. The consumer experiences were captured through semi-structured interviews with 49 households. So 19 of those were people who joined a CSA, a community supported agriculture veggie box scheme in South Wales in 2019. And 30 of them were randomly selected as a control group. And these interviews focused on changes on household food culture. So that was looking at food purchasing, preparation and consumption. And we had conducted baseline interviews with those people in 2019. And what we did is follow-up interviews with them in May and June this year, and to look specifically at changes in household food culture owing to the pandemic and lockdown. So today we're going to look at what we found and some opportunities to adapt the food system to cope with similar shocks in the future in ways that also might help to reduce inequality in society. So we're going to discuss pre-COVID-19 food system vulnerabilities with a spotlight on inequalities as some background, the potential for a people-centred transformation of food systems, and then the data that we found from our research, so that's the data on producers, consumers and community organisers' experiences of COVID-19. And some of those responses which foreshadow possible routes toward just transformations of the food system. And finally, for our conclusion, we're going to talk about what is needed to support people-centred transformation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Dr. Hannah Pitt, who will explain the background to the work now.
Thanks, Ella. So I think as various people who've been thinking about the food system for the past few years have been saying for some time, we kind of already knew there was problems with the food system, particularly those highlighted in that quote there, highlighting that at the currently and prior to COVID, there were harmful impacts on human health and environmental sustainability. And I think what we've experienced and noted as Corona hit was that the flaws that people had already highlighted in the food system were really brought into relief and in some cases worsened. So it's almost become a really, I hate to say it, but a useful learning opportunity for seeing what is problematic with the food system as it already was. Some of the things that people highlighted have been things like the reliance on a small pool of large retailers and producers, so everything being concentrated with a relatively small number of actors, and linked to that the reliance on just-in-time supply chains, hence the concern that food wouldn't be able to flow easily into the country early on in lockdown. And then relatedly, a dependence on imported labour as well as the imported food. We've been heavily reliant on workers coming in from overseas. So again, there was concern as travel restrictions hit, would workers be able to get here for the season in the UK? And if you look across these vulnerabilities, one thing that's quite striking is that there's a particular problem with inequality. So not everyone has been and is able to access good food. And linked to that, inability to access good food, there are further problems which arise further in embedding those inequalities, as we show on the next slide, which just draws out some of the ways that Corona has highlighted the links between inequality and food. So one of the things that came to light quite quickly was that food insecurity, so the ability to access enough food and enough good food, was quite quickly impacted by the crisis due to people losing their income, but also increases in prices for certain products. So we saw that food banks, for example, faced a dramatic increase in demand as more people were suffering from food insecurity. We also know that Corona has not hit everyone equally, and there are dietary factors to that. So dietary related ill health and diseases seem to be a factor in whether people were more severely affected by COVID and whether they had a greater chance of actually being killed by it. So there are some kind of links there to diet and food. And again, those are themselves connected with inequality. So we know that concentrations of dietary related ill health are greater amongst more deprived communities. Another factor related particularly to food production is that there have been outbreaks of the virus spreading kind of more easily in environments where low paid workers in the food system have been working. So there was meat packing plants up in Merthyr and elsewhere in the UK, and then also teams of harvest workers and certain vegetable and fruit growers also suffered outbreaks. And across all these inequalities which link COVID to food, there is the dimension of race. So obviously we'll all be aware that debates around anti-racism were coinciding with the pandemic, and I think this has really made us all reflect on the underlying inequalities and how those relate to the disproportionate number of people of colour who are in the more deprived communities and suffering more inequality in the UK. So that's the kind of picture of how inequality connects to food and Corona and some of the things that have been brought to light under the pandemic. And what we wanted to think about really was whether there are alternatives and more just and equal ways that things could be imagined and could be changed, which Poppy's going to move on to talk about now.
Thanks, Hannah, and hi everyone. Yeah, so as Chris Moore highlights, justice is often neglected within food policy discourse, particularly during times of crisis. And I guess this, as Hannah has said, has outlined, this has been particularly the case during COVID. And through our work, we're suggesting that a core aim of a people-centred approach is the cultivation of more just food systems, whereby power is redistributed and decision-making processes are inclusive and democratic. And we identify 5 key components of what is described as people-centred approach to food systems. So firstly, the processes of democratisation that take a rights-based approach to growing, trading and eating sustainable, healthy and culturally appropriate food. And second, the redistribution of power across food systems, including within businesses, organisations and across government. Third, the strengthening of opportunities for meaningful participation within the food system. Fourth, the need for the critical need for equity and justice within food systems. And this includes those who are currently marginalised, for example, those who might be undocumented or disenfranchised, as well as engaged citizens in determining food futures. And finally, the need for transformative governance processes that are centred around inclusive and democratic participation. So yeah, this just gives hopefully a sense of what we understand by people-centred transformation, and this has kind of guided some of our exploration of what's happening in Wales during COVID. So yeah, I'm going to hand over now. Back to Hannah.
Thanks, Poppy. So now we've kind of given the context and an insight into how we're thinking about the impacts of COVID and the pandemic. We're going to highlight some of the things that we found out by asking producers, consumers and community activists about their experiences of both of how they were impacted by the pandemic, but also what they were doing in response. So I'm going to start off by sharing some of the insights from producers. And I think what the conversations we had with them were very early on in lockdown, so during the first month. So it was really getting them to reflect on their initial impacts and how they were responding. And what came to light very dramatically was that growers of fruit and vegetables in Wales were facing a very sudden increase in demand. So particularly things like box schemes were inundated with calls from people who wanted to access fruit and vegetables from them. And you can see there the types of level of increase in demand that people were experiencing. Alongside this, there was also the sudden drop-off of typical supply routes such as wholesale, as catering and hospitality outlets closed. So some producers completely lost all their outlets that they would normally go trade through almost overnight. But what the producers were telling us was that they were quite rapidly working to adjust the way they were working, and particularly who they were selling produce to. So we didn't find that people were having to throw a lot of produce away. They were actually quite adaptable and able to find ways to sell and redirect their produce to particularly trading to local people more directly, to make sure that people were getting the produce that they wanted, but also to make sure it wasn't going to waste. So there was a really rapid response from producers, and what they felt this showed was how agile and adaptable they could be because of the scale of their operations, but also because of their good connections into local markets and into local communities. But as well as having to manage this sudden change in the way that they sell things and the way that they market and trade, they were also being required to introduce controls on their practices to make sure they were adhering to health and safety and the new measures that required social distancing. Some had lost their workers and their volunteers due to quarantine measures, or because people couldn't travel to the take-up positions, or because they themselves were suffering ill health. So there was a kind of perfect storm, as some of them described it, of all these multiple pressures, which created quite a lot of strain and additional workload, which for what tend to be quite small operations was a huge amount of workload and things to be managing under us in experience very rapidly. despite all this, it was quite notable that the growers were quite optimistic about what this said about them and their value to the local communities that they supply, but also to their, in terms of their potential to be able to produce more and to supply more of Wales's produce in the longer term. They felt that consumers were recognising that they have a valuable role and offered a kind of good quality, trusted product. And they were keen that this would be recognised and almost become an opportunity to do more and grow more in Wales. But the key thing they were saying was they were already struggling to do their best and to do as much as they could. And although there was this potential to grow more and a will to grow more, they really couldn't seize that opportunity without additional support, and particularly financial injection, which is what they were really looking to Welsh Government to do for them, as highlighted in that quote from one grower there. So there was definitely an aspiration to expand fruit and veg production in Wales, and the feeling that consumers wanted this and would take up this as well. But really, without that injection of cash and support, they would not be able to take up this opportunity. So moving on then to the consumer side of things, which Ella will be able to share.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Right, so what we did is we spoke to people who were members of community-supported agriculture veg box schemes, and that's where most of these indications come from. We also spoke to our control group, but a lot of that data is not analysed yet. So I'm going to give you only a very brief overview of what those sort of initial indications of what we've got there. So how have participants in these schemes changed their diets during lockdown? So far it suggests that there were not radical changes in what people were actually eating or how they thought about what they were eating. The main trend in terms of what people were eating was more treats, more snacks, more baking, eating more in general, and drinking more alcohol. And 71% of people that we spoke to reported that those changes were because of coronavirus and lockdown. So they directly attributed to that, not to seasonality or anything else. So what was very different was where people get food, or how people changed how they got food during lockdown. So as I said in the beginning, 86% reported changes to their grocery shopping. And overall, we found that kind of two main narratives emerged. So for some, lockdown was a period where they reduced the number of places they went, and they were just relying more heavily on supermarkets to just minimize the amount of journeys they were making outside, essentially. So that is kind of reflected in this first comment, that since lockdown, they're buying much more from Tesco's, which is their nearest big supermarket. And before that, they were sourcing quite a lot from local producers. So they'd get odds and ends from Tesco's, whereas now, essentially, they're not getting odds and ends from Tesco's. They're just getting everything from there. So they've massively reduced their investment in local economy and sustainability. And so on the other hand, we had another narrative which emerged as well, where other participants really sort of doubled down on their efforts to find local producers and shorter supply chains. And this was often people they were already supporting or sourcing produce from to some extent, or they knew of or had heard of. Or there was a lot of people who found new suppliers through what they referred to as local social media. So these households were often using supermarkets too, but trying to fulfill as many needs as they were able to through delivery from smaller local producers. And this really fits into what Hannah found as well. So those people who were agile enough to respond at the beginning of lockdown, those producers found very ready consumers who really wanted to find local stuff. So this person says, our greengrocers started to deliver. Our local fish shop is a sort of little kiosk, so we can drive down when there's very few people around and it's not a problem for social distancing. So they kind of prioritised those local producers. So we found that people tended to be unsatisfied with the changes they'd made to food sourcing if they'd shifted towards supermarkets, and more satisfied if they had found and were using local suppliers. And many participants commented that they wanted to maintain these more sustainable ways of acting or behaving that they'd taken on during lockdown, or that if they'd given up their more sustainable ways of getting hold of veg, they wanted to re-establish more sustainable behaviours post-lockdown. So they were quite conscious of the impacts of their behaviour. So with the control group participants, so far we found that 20% of participants have tried a new source of local food. So this control group are not necessarily at all people who have an interest in sustainability or local food. These are randomly selected members of the public. So we found 20% of them had tried out a new source of local food, and that 75% of them had started to grow food in some way for the first time. And that obviously interacts with the fact that people would have been on furlough or would have lost work and have more time freed up to be able to do that too. So it's going to be really interesting. We're continuing to follow these people, and we're just about to do another round of interviews with the Veg Box scheme members. And so it'll be really interesting to explore what sticks for the longer term, essentially, what changes become habits, what things stick, and how these impact on sustainability of the food system for a longer term. If you've got any questions at the end, then I'd love to answer them about that. I know it's a very brief overview of what we found, but I'm going to hand over to Alice now to talk about community organising.
Hi, thanks Ella. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just.
Okay, cool. I'll try and speak up. So the data on community action came from 4 interviews with active community organisers that I was already connected with through my research, and then participant observation in a Welsh community food network that established in response to COVID to connect different community food projects across Wales and discuss how they were dealing with the crisis. So you can see from the quote on this slide here, that as it became clear that lockdown measures were coming into place, then what we saw was a really rapid mobilisation of community networks and solidarity efforts, not only across Wales, but generally in the UK. You can see this map to the side here, which is the number of registered self-defined mutual aid and COVID-19 community response groups that all established very quickly at the start of lockdown to support local neighbours. So for instance, in Cardiff, over 20 neighbourhood groups were established in different parts of Cardiff, and these achieved hundreds of members within days. And the mutual aid groups involved neighbours helping each other with tasks like collecting food, shopping or prescription if someone was self-isolating or shielding. So it connected with the food and security aspect, and as well as other food projects. So additionally, there were many, like a wide range of local action from not only existing food projects, but also other community groups that expanded to food, as it was such a crucial aspect of the lockdown and what people needed, and then newly established food projects as well. And then this ranged from providing cooked meals and distributing those to other forms of food distribution and donations. And then on the other side of things, seed distribution for home growing and increased community food growing in different areas. We also saw councils responding quickly and working with local food projects and mutual aid groups, and a number of local food networks and forums established in different parts of Wales to connect different actors within the food system and coordinate responses. So different charities and grassroots groups with councillors and food banks, for instance. And while these community responses were really impressive, One critique has been that, for instance, council reliance on voluntary projects, which themselves rely on efforts of furloughed workers or unemployed people, is not really sustainable, and it kind of further turns towards this idea of big society in times of crisis, rather than governments or councils addressing the root causes of food insecurity that are there already. And this particular quote comes from a community organiser in West Wales, and yeah, they saw rapid mobilisation on a whole load of different projects, all connected with food, a lot of food production as well. So the linking of the urban and rural. And one thing they'd commented is that this is something they had always wanted to see, people taking on responsibility and collectively organising. So this initial period of lockdown, even though there were also doubts and awareness of like the sustainability of these efforts, because it was a particularly special time that people were, a lot of people were on furlough, or kind of everything was paused. Yeah, there was a lot of hope within community action efforts. Okay, so I'll pass on the next slide.
So that's looking at some of the ways that producers, consumers and communities were impacted. And as we said at the beginning, as well, the moments of crisis quite often bring into relief what's already flawed or problematic in a system and why it isn't resilient. But equally, a moment of crisis can also open windows of opportunities. So the other thing we were looking for was whether there were signs of changes and responses that foreshadowed opportunities to embed longer term transformation, and ways that resilience of the food system might be increased, particularly with a view to reducing inequality. So again, we looked across the research projects we were working on for these signs of positive change, which might become broader transformations of the food system. So we're just going to highlight some of these for you now. So firstly, was the changes and signs of change around food workers and labour in the food system. So you'll probably remember that people who work in supermarkets or out in the fields, and farmers, were amongst those called key workers during the pandemic, and very much celebrated as part of the community of people who were keeping the country moving, keeping us all fed. And there was a kind of huge recognition of the value of this kind of work, which has been typically kind of devalued and neglected and not seen as a particularly desirable form of work, perhaps. So this appreciation of the value of food workers and the people doing it was quite noticeable. And linked to this, we saw a number of calls for people to go and do work in farms and fields and food production to make up some of the gaps that were expected due to the loss of workers coming from overseas to work, particularly during harvest time. So there was various campaigns, including this one, Pick for Britain, which received a huge number of responses. Thousands of people registering their interest in taking up these harvest and field jobs. 2/3 of the applicants to Pick for Britain were new to this type of work, so it was people who hadn't worked in the food growing sector before. And what was particularly interesting was that, so I've been working on this topic of food, skills and labour for a couple of years now, and one of the things you get repeatedly told is that people from the UK quite simply don't want to do these jobs. They don't want to go and work in fields picking fruit and vegetables. But what we saw was that in this moment of crisis, UK citizens did actually respond and offer to do these jobs. So it kind of flipped on its head the narrative that nobody from the UK wanted to work in horticulture. However, as things panned out, it seemed that not a huge number of those UK citizens who applied for jobs or registered their interest followed through to either take them up or for carry on working across the whole season in those roles. And in particular, once other sectors that had been furloughed, so construction and hospitality, as they started going back to work, people went back into the jobs they'd been doing in those areas. So the situation now seems that yes, for this year we've had kind of a good take up or some take up of people from the UK, but whether that's going to be a longer term solution once things are kind of returning back to more normal labour patterns, it's not guaranteed that those people will still be available. And again, as we saw outbreaks of COVID in some of these food system production workplaces, it did raise questions about the conditions that those jobs are working in, and particularly the level of pay and rewards that you get for working in some of those jobs, and whether they remain an appealing option for people in the long term is still up for question. So that's one of the areas of signs of change which might link to longer term transformation. I'll hand over to Alice to move on to the next example.
Thanks. Yeah, and as Hannah mentioned earlier, in terms of supply chain resilience and producers, the majority of Welsh producers, at least in horticulture in our study, were able to respond and adapt to the crisis well, so the produce didn't go to waste and they retained or even increased their income. However, there are other aspects to consider in the supply chain, a big one being distribution systems and networks of support between producers. So the level of pre-existing distribution systems was a big factor in whether producers could divert produce to new markets, and consumers could also access food that producers had. So while we found quite a few examples of the crisis leading to the development of producer networks, collective distribution systems, and generally increased cooperation, as one of our participants highlighted, crisis is not really the ideal time to form partnerships and networks, as particularly for producers, when the going gets tough, everyone puts their head down. And many producers had to prioritize meeting what for some was quite a large spike in demand, and lacked time for establishing these networks that would have allowed them to reach more consumers and really make sure that food was distributed to those who needed it. So one really good example of a collaborative direct food distribution system is the Open Food Network, which is an online open source platform for local food distribution. And during lockdown, they experienced a huge surge in the number of producers and consumers signing up. We also came across other models of direct distribution being established in local areas to connect groups of producers with consumers, especially at times when it was harder to access supermarkets or people were seeking out different markets. And then in terms of producer and community networks, one key case study that we were looking at, which is an example of both a producer and a community response to COVID, is Plan Avoid or Plant Food in Machynlleth. So the group established in response to COVID off the back of an existing veg growing cooperative called Mac Mythlon, and they worked with local community members, shops and producers to organise seed swaps and distribute seed packs to families. They provided advice and training for home growers. They supported local producers by encouraging them to share machinery and tools, and collectively order like seeds in bulk and compost. They've also managed to expand land opportunities for local food production, and coordinate local crop planning to get more staple crops in the ground in the area. And then throughout lockdown, they've been distributing fresh food in the Dyfi Valley, and encourage local consumption by linking the people who seek out their advice to the local producers that they're connected with, and also holding a number of land army days throughout lockdown to support local producers, organic producers, to meet the increased demand. And while many of these responses are are really positive and show the resilience of different aspects of the supply chain. What we found is a lot of them were dependent on existing linkages, which could be strengthened or mobilized, whereas changing supply chains can be more difficult, where connections to urban populations or other local networks or producers are not already there, especially when there's an immense amount of pressure on producers, distributors, and retailers simply to meet demand when there's crisis. So I think it's these networks that are being built now can hopefully offer help in the future, but it would have been better if there were already established systems and networks that people can rely on, and increase the resilience of the system. And so moving on to the response from community and the promising aspects of local community action. We identified 3 examples of the food response, and those were the proliferation of home and community growing projects, the emergence of local food plans and partnerships and how they were used, and then online food assembly events, which I'll explain in a second. So as Ella already mentioned, there was a massive rise in people wanting to grow things at home, and along with that were loads of organisations such as community gardens or food organisations or councils or allotments, encouraging that home growing by distributing seeds, carrying out seed swaps. Yeah, seed pack distribution was a really popular aspect that a lot of projects in the network had followed, and generally linking up neighbours in their home growing efforts and offering training such as webinars. And this is a really interesting aspect of it, though obviously relies on people having time. So while there were loads of really positive examples in areas like, for instance, Riverside or Rondokine on Taff, of hundreds of seed packs being handed out and people being supported to grow veg, this still needs to be considered in relation to the wider context of food insecurity, as people need to have time and resources as well as skills to actually be able to grow any substantial amount. But still, it's an opportunity to engage people in growing, which was found to be a really positive thing with lots of good feedback, and just a way to find small connections with nature during what was quite a difficult period. So then in the second response, of strengthening or establishing local food plans and partnerships. This is happening in different parts of Wales and in different ways. And the defining characteristics of these were the collaboration and joined up planning between councils and then local food organisations, projects, producers and businesses. Often this meant working as well with health services and the joining together the various aspects of local governance that are relevant for food but often remain segmented. And several events were hosted over lockdown to spread this idea and share key examples such as Food Cardiff, which is part of the Sustainable Food Places Network, and then Our Food Crickhowl, which actually launched, I think, during lockdown. And so these could be started in a number of different ways. They could use the Sustainable Food Places Network and that model, or they could be established by a range of local actors, driven either by councils or from grassroots action. And then the final response we looked at was online food assemblies, or they use this term trafodwn, which translates as let us discuss. So these were people's assemblies, which are a grassroots method of deliberative democracy. And they addressed issues of food and farming that were focused on a particular locality. And events during lockdown, these online events were hosted in at least 4 places in Wales. It's more than that, but there are the 4 that I definitely have data for. And those were including Ceredigion, Pembrokeshire and the Brecon Beacons. So the very first event was initiated by a local Extinction Rebellion group, and then further events involved other groups. And participants were wide-ranging. There was a real effort to reach out, particularly in rural areas, to farmers and different members of the community who weren't engaged in those conversations already, or to get opposing views in the room together, or in the online space together. And this was also represented in the speakers that had, for instance, in one event there were speakers from NFU, NFUW, as well as Land Workers Alliance, and then local councillors. And participation generally ranged from around 50 to 150 people. So at the top end, getting really quite large participation. And this can be seen as a really positive example, I think, of food citizenship, though also the limitations around inclusion, and also like how the outcomes which are now being brought together from the different events can actually be implemented or translated into policy, also need to be considered. And hopefully these three examples can be built upon to strengthen the role of community action in creating more resilient and sustainable food systems. Hand over to you, Poppy.
Thanks, Alice. So just bringing this to a conclusion, drawing upon lessons learned from the COVID-19 kind of pandemic crisis landscape, we suggest that a people-centred approach can help steer the course towards sustainable and just food futures. First, COVID-19 highlights the critical need for a rights-based approach to food so that all people can have equitable opportunity to not only access healthy, nourishing, sustainable food, but also to participate in sustainable and just food systems. And this includes not only those who are the most vulnerable to food insecurity, but also those who are marginalised at present from the food system. Second, COVID-19 highlights the key role local food partnerships can play in supporting equitable and democratic participation in food systems, as Alice highlighted earlier. And within this work, the need to attend to those who are kind of currently marginalised within the food system. Third, challenges highlighted by growers, as Hannah highlighted during the pandemic, especially those who are small and medium scale, highlight the need for a kind of change in the policy and planning and legislative landscape that addresses some of these challenges. And this includes access to land, especially some of those smaller scale and medium scale growers who saw a real increase in interest to subscribe to a community supported agriculture or box scheme, but they needed more land to be able to meet the demand. So access to land, support with access to land would be a key thing that the governance landscape could help with, but also infrastructure. And this includes, for example, support with polytunnels, growing infrastructure, access to groundworks, but also trading infrastructure. So this could include bringing growers together to distribute through kind of growers cooperatives, and yeah, just space for distribution as well as access to markets. And we recognise a key role that public procurement could play in kind of boosting these different ways of trading, different ways to grow. And fourth, the research highlights the potential role small and medium scale producers, particularly in horticulture, can play in terms of supporting food resilience within Wales. But it also highlights current gaps, and we suggest, more support for shorter food supply chains and support for collaborative and partnership-based work across the food system could in turn support more diverse food landscapes. And finally, we highlight the key role that participatory and democratic processes, the key role that transformative governance processes that enable participatory and democratic process could play in the future of food systems determining the future of food systems collectively. So I'll draw it to a conclusion there and perhaps hand over to Alice. If anyone would like to ask us a question, we can respond.
Thanks for that, everyone. It was really interesting. Let's just have a look at the chat here. Sorry, let me make it a bit bigger. Okay, so we've got a question from Barbara. It says, "Hi all, brilliant presentation, thank you. I really appreciate how you bring together various parts of the food chain, producers, consumers, distribution and organisations. I'm wondering about two things. Is there any follow-up research on the experience of new seasonal agriculture workers who took up those roles during the pandemic for the first time? And do you have any examples of councils over-relying on mutual aid groups?"
So I can answer the first part of that. Interestingly, during the season around the UK, there were various media reports and online discussions from people who had taken up some of the roles, and I would say it's mixed kind of experiences, as you might expect. Some people kind of quite critical of the jobs and the conditions, others kind of who have really taken to it and are kind of looking to do more than the one season. And I've recently started, as part of my broader work on horticultural skills, discussion with one of the farms who did take on more UK workers for the first time this year. So we'll be talking to both the employers and some of the people who took on those roles to find out how it's been for them. So yeah, there will be more to come on that. And maybe on the point about mutual aid and over-reliance on them, Alice might be best placed to say something on that.
Yeah, I think probably speaking from the data, I wouldn't want to say anything due to kind of confidentiality of data, but it was a general critique that could be seen. I can refer you to some articles written about it, not only here but in other countries, linking the kind of how councils were directing people to mutual aid groups and other community responses in certain cases, such as, for instance, if they needed to access food shopping but didn't need to be supplied with food, so if they could pay for their own food. So yeah, I can't give any specific council examples that come from the data, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Alice. Just got a question from Susan that says, "Can I ask a question about why there is a focus on a rights-based approach which is rooted in the individual level, given your emphasis is on community and equity?"
I can make a start with that. So yeah, we're drawing on the Scotland's right. It's a good question, Susan. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think we were really inspired by Scotland's Right to Food bill, and perhaps, yeah, a recognition that even within community, the distribution of at a community scale, the distribution of power can still be a challenge, and perhaps the rights-based approach gives every individual. It takes into consideration every individual, where even on a community-based level, that can be a challenge. So I think, yeah, the right to access food, grow food, and distribute food for individuals feels like it takes into consideration like diverse voices, which maybe might not necessarily happen, even though communities might aspire to that. And I don't know if anyone else wants to come in there.
I guess, yeah, just to add that, yes, it's individual in that it's focused on every individual having the right to food, but how that right is met and how we ensure that that right is fulfilled need not be on an individual level. It could be through community responses and collective action. So I don't think there has to be a tension there.
Okay, thank you very much. Susan says, "I guess it is good to distinguish the right to food from a rights-based approach in your work." Okay, are there any other questions? Doesn't seem at the moment like we've got any other questions. So as we are nearing 1 o'clock. I'll just say thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for kicking off the Sustainable Places webinar series for the autumn. Good work. We've got a seminar running every Thursday until the beginning of December, so please do have a look at our programme and see if there's anything else that interests you. And yeah, thank you to all the speakers, and it will be online soon, so if you want to watch it back or have any questions, then do let us know. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks. Bye-bye.